So tonight, we are in Daniel chapter 11. We are in part 4 of the prophetic history. Why do we call it prophetic history? Because Daniel's vision for him was prophetic. None of this stuff had happened yet. But as we look back at Daniel's prophecy, we see every bit of it fulfilled historically, without question. I mean, we can look back at this stuff and just everything lines up and we can say, yes, this was all fulfilled. Here's where it was fulfilled. So God's prophetic truth through Daniel is completely fulfilled. There is no error in it whatsoever. So last week we looked at 2 weeks ago rather, we looked at verses 21 through 27. And we began to look at the history of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is the forerunner, the foreshadowing rather, of Antichrist to come. And in those verses that we read last week, we saw, his cunning, I want to say, but I don't think that was the word I used. His craftiness, his cunning, and his conquest. And this week we will look at the remaining portion concerning him, which is going to be verses 28 through 35, and we will see his cruelty towards the people of God, towards Israel. And we noted, again, this Antiochus Epiphanes, we read about him back in chapter 8 of Daniel. Who was he, or how was he identified in chapter 8 of Daniel? He wasn't named. Daniel didn't come out and say, hey, this guy Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, he's going to be the one that's going to come. No, he was identified as being the little horn in the prophecy and the vision that Daniel had. And we read a lot about his history, what was going to happen with him in chapter 8. But this is just kind of a revisiting that, a little bit more detail. Bob?
The little horn, I think that's more tied to what's coming than what was back then.
Well, again, it was a historical picture. Because, the crown and then the little horn and all that was fulfilled in those kingdoms, the kingdom of Rome and Greece and such. And he came out of those kingdoms, out of the kingdom of Greece. Of what? But in chapter 8, it comes out of the 4. Yeah, it comes out of the little horn. It comes out of the 4. Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and read verses 28 through 35. And then we'll go through and we'll look at his cruelty as it occurs in here. And again, we'll kind of look at the verses one at a time. We'll discuss them and we'll talk about how historically it's been fulfilled already. So let's read it through, starting at verse 28. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits, and return to his own land. At the time appointed he shall return, and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Shittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by the flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them understanding shall fall, to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So right away we're seeing here that there's already an appointed time, and I think that's where we finished off at last time we were in it. We were talking about the fact that Antiochus could do nothing outside of what God had allowed him to do, and there was going to be an appointed time that everything was going to come to an end. So verse 28 we have here that says, then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. Who is the holy covenant? Jerusalem, the people of Israel. Yeah, the Jews. That is the holy covenant. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. As Antiochus is returning home from his battle, he hears some things that are going on in Jerusalem. There is an insurrection building. There are people there that are trying to oppose him. Why are they trying to oppose Antiochus at this point? Because he has tried to impose his religious beliefs upon all of the kingdoms that were under his domain. Now, he was not a Jew. He was not for worshiping Jehovah. He was of a Hellenistic belief. He was one that worshiped Zeus. And he wanted Zeus worship, that Hellenistic type worship, to be universal throughout all of his kingdom. And he has tried to impose this on the Jews. And the Jews that are opposed to this, the Jews that still follow after Jehovah, they're trying to rise up. They're trying to form up against him. And he took action. He opposed their rebellion. He went to Jerusalem, and it is recorded that he killed 40,000 men, women, and children, and put possibly another 40,000 into slavery as a result of that little insurrection, that little bit of conflict that he heard about. Verse 29 says, and at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or the latter. He will again invade Egypt to the south, and at first he met with some success until he reached Alexandria. Then he met the power that had destroyed his father, that fourth empire, Rome. If you look at verse 30, it says there, for the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and returned and have indignation again against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the covenant. Chittim is actually Cyprus, the city of Cyprus. And Cyprus had a fleet of ships. And that's what opposed him and stopped his advancement. And this was some sort of an agreement between the Romans and Egypt at this point. There is a man by the name of Gaius Popilus Linus. And he is the one that led the Roman advance against Antiochus to prevent him from coming any further than he did. And he met with Antiochus to form some kind of a treaty. This is as far as you go, you don't go any further kind of thing. And Antiochus actually asked for time to consider this proposal. And Gaius drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and demanded that he answer before he stepped out of that circle. Because if he didn't, he was going to die right there in the circle. So he submitted, because if he didn't, there was a good chance he would die right there. And even if he didn't die, he would have basically been declaring war against Rome. And Rome was much bigger and more powerful than he was at the time. And he had used Rome as an ally before, because we talked about how Antiochus was very deceptive. He was very cunning. He was very crafty. He would make friendships that benefited him for a period of time. And then when he was done with them, he would just move on. Well, he had done that before. So he knew better. And he had no alternative but to turn around and return home. And again, because of his defeat, because of his frustration, he took it out on the people of the Holy Covenant. Again, he went back against Jerusalem. He shall have indignation against the Holy Covenant. When he returned this time, his fury was completely against the whole Mosaic system. He wanted to eliminate any worship that the Jews had other than that of Zeus. Prior, it was kind of, okay, as long as you worship Zeus along with, you're okay. But now it's getting to the point where he's like, I don't want this other worship going on at all. You're going to worship one God and one God only, and that's going to be Zeus. Well, how do you think that went over with the people of God? Some went along with it. That's what he's talking about there when it says, the end of the verse there, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. There would be some that would forsake it. They would give it up for their own safety, to go along for protection, for whatever reason. They would follow after his teachings. They would follow after the Zeus worship. They would forsake God. And that idea there of having intelligence with them also, different versions depending on how it's written, kind of impose the idea of he would take care of those that were willing to follow after Zeus and follow after the Hellenistic teachings that he was pushing on the people, as far as he would actually reward them with the spoils. As he was destroying the Jews that were opposed to him, he would take their stuff and give it to the ones that were following after him. They would be rewarded. It got to a point, though, like I mentioned before, where he didn't want the Jews to have any religion other than what he was imposing upon them. And Antiochus wound up sending in one of his generals, Apollonius, and he came into Jerusalem peacefully as he came in on the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath, he attacked and killed many men, women, and children, looting, burning, slaughtering many of the Israelites. He would seize treasure from the temple and return the gold to Antiochus. And all of this was done to instill fear into the people of Jerusalem so that they would follow after and forsake the covenant. Verse 31 says, an arm shall stand on his part, they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. The king made it impossible for them to practice Judaism at all. Suspending the sacrifices, he stopped the sacrifices. You are not allowed to make sacrifices. He destroyed all copies of scriptures that were found, tried to destroy the writings. He forbade circumcision. If you had a child and you were trying to, on the 8th day, circumcise, you could be killed for circumcising your child. I mean, he just really wanted to eliminate any practice of any other religion other than that of the Hellenistic worship. Not only that, it went further. The people of Jerusalem were forced to make sacrifice to Zeus. He actually wound up setting sentries at the temple, guards at the temple, to prohibit the Jews from making their sacrifices and only allowing sacrifices to the idol of Zeus. And you know where they set up that idol of Zeus? Inside the temple. That was the beginning of the ultimate desecration of the temple. Once they had set up the idol to Zeus, they actually sacrificed a pig on the altar. According to the Maccabees and some other historical documents, on December 15th of 167 BC, an altar or idol statue devoted to Zeus was erected in the temple. That is the abomination that shall cause desolation. And on December 25th of that same year, sacrifices, including swine, were offered on the altar. The temple was desecrated. The abomination of desolation is a historical reality. Daniel spoke of it long before it happened. Historically, guess what? Happened. Been fulfilled. Verse 32 says, "And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." Verse is kind of split up between two different groups of people. The first half are those that have rejected, those who have accepted this new teaching, those who have gone against the covenant. He shall corrupt by flatteries. He will continue to bribe and support and give to them what they need as long as they continue on his behalf. But the second half, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Always seems to be a faithful remnant, doesn't there? Always. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Some people knew who their God was, and they took a brave stand. And this wicked king, and defied this wicked king rather, and endured all the consequences to stay true to the one true God, Jehovah. Verse 33 says, "And they that understood among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by the flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days." There were many that were faithful to God, to his word. And they moved around and encouraged people to stand firm and tried to continue teaching them from the scriptures. And a lot of people had their faith strengthened as a result of it. And the people were stirred because of it. Israel was being revived because of it. But there was a cost. There were daily executions. People were burned alive. Others were imprisoned and made slaves. This persecution spread throughout the whole of the land. Everywhere the decrees were enforced by violent means. As I mentioned before, to circumcise a newborn meant death. Scriptures were burned. People were forced to sacrifice to Zeus. Violation of the Sabbath was enforced, and many caved in. Many yielded to those demands. It was something that Israel had never experienced before to this extent. Why would God allow all this to happen?
He used what was bad, turned that into the Septuagint, but gave the word of God to a whole bunch more people.
Okay. I think he begins to answer that question in verses 34 and 35. Now, when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them understanding shall fall to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. The idea of purging, to make them white, to try them, it was a cleansing going on. It was a purification going on. During this period of testing, they would receive what would seem like a little help from God. They would not be delivered from the fire of persecution like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. They will not be delivered from the mouth of the lion like Daniel was. They will endure this trial. And many will lose their life. But God is doing something through this. Some will come and try to join to them through flattery, try to build them up, but they're not going to listen. Those ones that are coming around and trying to win them over by flattery are trying to spin the truth to get them to go the other way and forsake Jehovah. But they won't. The purpose behind their fall is that they might be purified, made white. And this will be true for all who fall until the end. This is a call for endurance. Their hope in this situation has to be in God. They have to trust in Him. God's purpose is purifying the nations from its apostasies and sin. God was still on the throne, just like we've talked about from the beginning. God is sovereign over all the affairs of men, the kings and the kingdoms and the nations. God is sovereign over all this. And He had already set a time limit to it. Not even Antiochus IV Epiphanes could go one step beyond the moment in time that God had decreed this would all come to an end. I mentioned the insurrection that had started earlier. The ray of hope for many of the Jews during this period of time would be those Maccabees. That one priest, Matthias, and his 5 sons who began that revolt, that uprising, would rebel against the armies of Antiochus. By the end of 6 years, Judas Maccabees would be the real power in the Holy Land. And they would march to Jerusalem and they would recover the city. And if you remember in chapter 8, we talked about all this taking place too. There was a day where they would go in and that they would repair, cleanse, and rededicate the temple for what would become known as the Feast of Dedication. Or there's a more modern name for it that we might recognize, Hanukkah. And it was incorporated into Israel's calendar as a day of remembrance for the day that the temple was restored and cleansed. All of these verses that we read from verse 21 all the way through 35 have been historically fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes. And if you remember back when we looked at chapter 8, we read about his end that would come. And his end was not a glorious end. It was an end that came because it was God's time for him to be removed. The following verses, the remaining verses of chapter 11, have to do with that one that Antiochus was in a foreshadow of. A picture, a prophecy concerning Antichrist, who has not yet come. At least that we know of. Next week, Lord willing, we will begin to look at those verses and consider the future events. They were future for Daniel, prophetic for Daniel, and yet prophetic for us as well. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this time together this evening. Thank you for the time for prayer and time for this study tonight, Lord. Help us in all of this, Lord, to focus on you, to focus on how you would have us to serve you day by day, sharing the light of Christ, preparing our hearts and the people around us for the end. Amen.